Have you ever gotten on a plane and felt that butterflies in your stomach, that feeling that something was out of place? On Flight 9113, the passengers felt it too. But what happened to them was beyond any nightmare. Lights flashing, voices whispering, and a mystery so dark that the plane simply disappeared from radar. Want to know what really happened that night? Stay with me, because this is a story that will leave you breathless and make you think twice before boarding your next flight. Title of the first story: Flight 917, The Mystery That Never Landed. Hey, before we continue with the video, just make sure you're already subscribed to the channel, because here we're going to bring you a series of videos like this with incredible, terrifying stories for you. We continue. The clock read exactly 10:45 p.m. when the airport loudspeakers announced the last call for Flight 917. Clara, a young journalist in search of a new story, clutched her ticket in her hands as she hurried toward the boarding gate. The airport was relatively quiet, but there was something in the air that bothered her. Maybe it was fatigue, or maybe it was that feeling of being watched. When she finally stepped onto the plane, she was greeted by the friendly smile of a flight attendant. The plane was full, but surprisingly quiet. Clara noticed that the passengers around her seemed introspective, almost as if they were immersed in a collective trance. She shook her head, laughing at her own fertile imagination, and made her way to her window seat in row 18. The captain announced that the flight would be uneventful and that the destination would be reached in just over 2 hours. The engines began to roar and the plane began its race down the runway. Clara stared out the window, watching the airport lights grow dimmer and dimmer, but as the plane climbed, a strange feeling came over her. It was as if something invisible was pressing down on her chest. She looked around and realized she wasn't the only one. Many passengers were gripping the armrests of their seats tightly, their faces pale. Suddenly, a strong vibration ran through the plane. It wasn't exactly turbulence, but something more irregular. The interior lights flickered briefly, and the sound of the engine seemed to change tone, becoming deeper. The flight attendant walked down the aisle with a professional smile, trying to calm the passengers. Ladies and gentlemen, everything is under control. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened. But there was something in her eyes that didn't convince Clara. She seemed nervous, glancing at the cockpit every few seconds, as if waiting for some instruction. Clara tried to distract her mind, but it was then that she saw something inexplicable. Through the window, a dense, almost silvery fog began to form around the plane. It didn't make sense. They were thousands of feet above sea level. How could there be fog there? She felt a shiver run down her spine. It was as if the fog had a life of its own, as if it was surrounding the plane on purpose. Another vibration shook the plane, this time stronger. The commander came back on the radio, but his voice sounded different, thick with tension. Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a slight anomaly. Please remain calm and in your seats. His tone was not reassuring. Clara looked around again and noticed that people were beginning to murmur. Some were nervously looking at their phones. Others were closing their eyes as if in prayer. The journalist took out her notebook. Her professional instinct told her that something important was happening, something that perhaps no one could explain. She scribbled a few words: unusual fog, nervous passengers, vibrations. But her writing was interrupted by a high-pitched sound, like a whistle, coming from outside the plane. She looked out the window again, but now everything was dark. There were no stars, nor the glow of the city lights below. It was as if the plane was floating in the void. Clara felt her breathing quicken. She knew that this flight would not be like the others. Something was very, very wrong. And the worst part, it was only the beginning. The flight seemed to have entered a strange limbo. The captain was no longer giving updates over the radio, and the silence on board was almost as suffocating as the darkness outside. Clara looked around and noticed that the passengers were restless. Many were murmuring in low tones, while others stared fixedly at the seats in front of them as if hypnotized. It was a collective behavior she had never witnessed before. It was then that Clara noticed something curious. The clock on the entertainment screen in front of her was showing local time, but it didn't seem to be working properly. The minutes didn't pass. It was as if time had frozen. At the same time, the cabin lights flickered almost imperceptibly, creating unsettling shadows on people's faces. The sound of the engines seemed more muffled, almost like a distant groan. Suddenly, a child began to cry. Clara turned to locate the sound and saw a small boy clinging to his mother's arm, pointing with a trembling finger toward the empty aisle. "There's a man over there," he stammered, his voice muffled by his crying. His mother tried to calm him, but her eyes betrayed that she was also frightened. There was no one in the aisle, only the shadows cast by the flashing lights. The feeling of unease intensified when one of the flight attendants hurried past, her face pale and her eyes wide. She tried to maintain her composure, but Clara noticed that she was clutching something in the pocket of her uniform, as if it were an amulet or a cross. This only reinforced the idea that something was very wrong. The journalist decided to summon up the courage and call the flight attendant. "Excuse me, what's going on?" Clara asked, trying to sound calm. The flight attendant hesitated, looked around as if she were being watched, and then answered in a whisper, "Madam, please stay in your seat. I can't say anything more right now, but it's best not to. Look out the window." That last sentence made Clara even more nervous. Shouldn't she look out the window? What was out there? Ignoring the warning, she slowly turned her face to the glass. What she saw made her hold her breath. Something was moving in the silvery mist. They weren't defined shapes, but figures that seemed to dance around the plane. They were fast, almost impossible to follow with the eyes, but they were there. She was sure of it. Clara tried to take a picture with her cell phone, but as soon as she pointed the camera, the device turned off by itself. It wasn't just her cell phone. Several passengers were trying to use their devices, and none of them worked. The screens were blank, as if all the electricity had been drained. Suddenly, a metallic sound echoed through the cabin, as if something had scratched the outside of the plane. Everyone looked at each other, tense, as the sound repeated itself, louder and closer. Clara felt her heart race. It wasn't her imagination. Something or someone was out there. And then, a hoarse voice echoed through the aircraft's PA system, but it wasn't the captain's. It was a cold, almost inhuman voice. "You've crossed the line. You shouldn't be here." Panic took over the cabin. Some people began to scream. Others cried in despair. Clara, trying to remain calm, wrote frantically. In her notebook, voices in the system, figures in the fog, devices turned off. She knew she needed to record everything, but she also felt that time was running out. Something was about to happen, and no one knew if there was any way to stop it. So, have you ever heard of airplane horror stories? Leave a comment with what you know about this, and if you believe these stories. Continuing, the atmosphere in the cabin was already suffocating, but what happened next plunged everyone into absolute terror. The plane, previously filled with the muffled sound of the engines and the nervous murmurs of the passengers, plunged into a disturbing silence. It was an unnatural silence, almost as if the sound itself had been sucked out of space. Clara noticed that even the child's crying had stopped, but the boy's frightened gaze remained fixed on the corridor. She looked ahead, her heart hammering in her chest, and saw something she would never forget. In the narrow corridor of the aircraft, a figure began to take shape. At first, it seemed only a shadow, as if the flickering lights were playing tricks on her eyes. But as the figure materialized, details began to emerge. He was a tall man, dressed in an old pilot's uniform, but the fabric was worn, as if it had been eaten away by time. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, those eyes, were empty, two black sockets that seemed to suck in all the light around them. He walked slowly down the aisle, but his footsteps made no sound. The passengers froze, as if under some kind of spell. Clara tried to scream, but her voice seemed to catch in her throat. She gripped her pen so tightly that it nearly broke, but she forced herself to record what she was seeing in her notebook. Man in the aisle. Pilot. Not human. Black eyes. Chills. As the man advanced, he slowly turned his head toward Clara. It was impossible, but she felt as if he could see her, as if he knew she was trying to document the moment. A disturbing smile formed on his dry lips, revealing yellowed and broken teeth. He stopped next to a woman sitting a few rows in front of Clara. The woman seemed to be in a trance, unable to look away from him. The ghost pilot raised a thin, cadaverous hand and pointed it at the ceiling of the plane. It was then that a high-pitched buzzing sound filled the cabin, causing everyone to cover their ears. Clara looked up and saw something that made her mind reel. The ceiling seemed to transform, revealing a starry, infinitely dark sky, as if the plane were no longer flying within the Earth's atmosphere, but somewhere between dimensions. Suddenly, the pilot disappeared, as if he had never been there, but the silence persisted, and the feeling that something much bigger was about to happen hung in the air. Clara looked at the other passengers. They were frozen, as if time had stopped again. Only she seemed able to move, to think. It was then that Clara noticed something on the seat where the pilot had stopped. A small object, a kind of rusty medallion, was on the floor. She stood up hesitantly and picked it up carefully. The metal was cold as ice, even in that stuffy cabin. Turning the medallion over, he saw that it had a name engraved on it. Captain Edward Gray. A shiver ran down her spine. That name wasn't unfamiliar. Years ago, she had read about a plane that disappeared in the 1940s, piloted by none other than Captain Gray. The plane was never found, but reports of its disappearance were shrouded in mystery and supernatural events. Before she could think any further, the cabin lights came back on abruptly, and the passengers began moving around again, as if nothing had happened. No one seemed to remember the man in the aisle, or the terrifying vision of the starry sky. But Clara knew it hadn't been a hallucination, and that medallion was proof of that. Clutching the object tightly, she decided she had to find out more. Something about this flight was not normal, and she was determined to reveal the truth, even if it meant facing something that was beyond human comprehension. Clara held the medallion with trembling hands, not fully understanding what had happened. As everyone seemed to return to normal, she felt a presence at her side. She turned slowly and saw, sitting in the seat next to her, a man who had not been there before. He did not look scary like the ghost pilot, but something about his appearance was unsettling. He wore period clothing, typical of the 1940s, and his eyes held a deep sadness. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. Clara nodded, unable to speak. He pointed to the medallion in his hands. "This belongs to Captain Gray. He tried to save the passengers, but he was trapped between worlds. He needs help to find peace." Before Clara could respond, the man continued. "You were chosen to carry this story, but remember, some truth should not be revealed to everyone." Suddenly, he disappeared, leaving only a faint scent of smoke in the air. Clara looked around, but no one seemed to notice what had happened. The weight of responsibility fell upon her. Who was this man, and what did it mean to be chosen? Determined, she knew that when she landed, she had to find answers. Something about that flight was linked to the past and now to her future. When the captain announced the approach for landing, Clara looked out the window and noticed something disturbing. the landscape did not match the predicted destination. Instead of city lights, she saw a vast, empty field covered in thick fog. The plane seemed to be flying in circles, stuck in limbo. The passengers began to murmur, each dealing with their own uneasiness. Clara felt the medallion grow warm in her hands, as if it were trying to warn her. That was when she heard that same ghostly voice again. Not all who embark complete the journey. Are you ready to make your choice? Suddenly, the plane began to shake violently as if something was trying to pull it down. The muffled scream of a child, the sound of desperate prayers, and Clara's icy silence mixed in that growing chaos. What seemed to be a simple landing became a race against the unknown, and then everything stopped. There were no more sounds. There was no more movement. Clara opened her eyes and realized that she was alone in the cabin. All the seats were empty except hers. The aircraft, now completely abandoned, was on a runway that seemed to belong to no other world. But what happened to the other passengers? And more importantly, what happened to Clara? Now the question that no one can answer remains. Did the plane really land, or did it disappear forever? If you want to know more about intriguing and frightening stories like this one, don't miss the next videos. Are there more mysteries like this in the sky? And would you be willing to board a flight knowing that it might never reach its destination? Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and share so that more people can learn about these hidden secrets. The next story may be even more disturbing. Title of the second story: The Last Flight of Crew 702. Imagine boarding a seemingly normal flight, but in the middle of the sky, everything changes. Strange voices echo, passengers disappear, and a dark secret about the plane comes to light. This isn't just another horror story. It's one that defies logic and will make you think twice about flying again. Are you ready to find out what happened to the 702 crew? Stay with me, because this is a story you'll never forget. It was a seemingly ordinary morning at Denver International Airport. The loudspeakers announced the departures, and passengers crowded the boarding gates. Among them was Clara, a journalist in search of stories. She had traveled countless times, but something about this flight stirred an inexplicable unease. Flight 702, bound for Seattle, was scheduled to take off at 10:30 a.m. From the moment Clara saw the number on the ticket, a shiver ran down her spine. There was no logical reason, but that number seemed to carry weight. In the waiting room, passengers exchanged weary glances. A family tried to calm a crying baby. A man in a suit typed frantically on his laptop, and a woman with a headscarf seemed to be mumbling something like a prayer. Clara watched everything, her attentive gaze taking in every detail. It was then that she noticed something peculiar. The flight attendants. The flight attendants seemed different. Their smiles were too wide, almost frozen. Their gazes were distant, as if they were somewhere else. When boarding was finally called, Clara felt her heart race. Something was wrong, but she couldn't put her finger on it. She stepped onto the plane, an older model that seemed out of place for a commercial flight. The seats were a faded greenish hue, and the air had a faint, musty smell. The lights flickered slightly, but no one seemed to care. Clara chose her seat by the window and fastened her seatbelt. The man next to her, who appeared to be in his 50s, looked at her and murmured, "Do you feel that way too?" Clara frowned. "What do I feel?" "This heaviness, as if we were going to a place from which we should never return." Before Clara could respond, a deep voice sounded over the speakers. "Guests, welcome to Flight 702. Our journey will last approximately 2 hours. Please make yourself comfortable and enjoy the flight." It was a standard message, but the pilot's tone was unsettling. He spoke with a measured slowness, almost as if he wanted every word to be engraved in the passengers' minds. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, Clara looked out the window. Outside, The sky seemed grayer than usual, even for an autumn morning. The plane accelerated, and within seconds it took off. But instead of a sense of relief, Clara felt as if the plane had crossed an invisible barrier. The environment had changed. The flight attendants' frozen smiles now seemed even more unsettling. They walked down the aisle, but their footsteps made no sound. It was as if they were floating. One of them, a woman with short hair and a rigid posture, stopped next to Clara and looked directly at her. Her smile disappeared, and her eyes seemed almost empty. "Do you need something, ma'am?" the flight attendant asked, her voice low and slurred. Clara shook her head, trying to ignore the knot forming in her stomach. Something about this flight didn't make sense, and the departure, which should have been the beginning of a peaceful journey, seemed to be the prelude to something much darker. As the plane stabilized in the air, silence filled the cabin. It wasn't the kind of comfortable silence that accompanies peaceful flights. It was thick, unsettling, as if something was sucking the energy out of people. Clara looked around, trying to figure out what was wrong. The conversations that normally filled the air had turned into rare, brief whispers, almost as if the passengers were afraid of being overheard. The first thing that caught her attention was the lady she had seen earlier in the boarding lounge. The woman in the scarf now had her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the seat in front of her. Her lips moved soundlessly, as if she were reciting an endless prayer. Clara tried to smile at her, but the lady just looked away, terrified. The man next to her, the same one who had mentioned the strange weight, began to drum his fingers on the armrest. It was a rapid, almost frantic movement. He seemed to want to say something, but hesitated. Finally, he turned to Clara. "You noticed, didn't you?" "Notice what?" Clara asked, trying to keep her voice steady. He leaned forward slightly, as if afraid of being overheard. "They!" He pointed subtly with his chin at the flight attendants who were standing at the back of the plane, motionless as statues. "They're not normal. They don't blink. They don't move like we do." Clara glanced back, trying to appear inconspicuous. And he was right. The two flight attendants were standing side by side, but their gazes were not focused on anything. It was as if they were staring into space, but at the same time, aware of everything around them. Clara's expression hardened, and the man continued, "This plane, I feel like we're not where we should be." Before Clara could respond, a disturbing sound echoed through the plane, a slight creaking sound, followed by a strange vibration in the walls of the aircraft. It wasn't like normal turbulence. It was different, almost as if something was moving inside the walls of the plane. Clara began to observe the other passengers more closely. Many had rigid expressions, their eyes wide, but no one seemed willing to talk about what they were feeling. Some looked at their watches repeatedly, but Clara noticed something strange. All the clocks showed different times. It was then that a baby began to cry. The sound was high-pitched and desperate, but the strangest thing was that its mother seemed completely listless, staring into space. Clara frowned and started to get up to help, but stopped when she realized that the baby's crying had simply stopped. Out of nowhere, the mother remained still, as if nothing had happened. The man next to her took a deep breath, his face covered in sweat. "This isn't normal," he murmured. At that moment, a flight attendant began to walk down the aisle. Her steps were slow, measured. Clara noticed that she wasn't carrying anything, no tray, no service cart. She was just walking, staring at the passengers. When she passed Clara, the air seemed to freeze. The journalist felt a chill run down her spine. It was then that the flight attendant stopped next to the man next to Clara. Slowly, she leaned towards him and, with a smile that seemed to split her face in two, said, "You should have stayed on solid ground." The man turned pale, but before he could react, the flight attendant moved on as if nothing had happened. Clara looked at the man, but he was motionless, unable to say a word. Flight 702 seemed less and less like a simple means of transportation. Clara felt that something was unfolding, something that no one was willing to name. And the further the plane went, the more the feeling that they were trapped in an inevitable fate grew. As the flight continued, Clara noticed that the flight attendants had disappeared. No one was walking the aisles anymore. Their presence, although strange and uncomfortable, at least indicated some normalcy. Now, their absence seemed like an omen. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the cabin's PA system. All the passengers looked around, alert. It was the characteristic sound of the pilot making an announcement, but something was wrong. The crack lasted for a few seconds, followed by an annoying hiss. Then, a voice rang out. "Passengers of Flight 702. The voice was distorted, with a cold, robotic tone, but clearly male. Clara leaned forward, trying to listen carefully, but the voice seemed to come from all sides, as if the sound were passing through the fuselage. "Welcome to your final destination." The hissing sound returned, and this time it was accompanied by a low, almost wailing sound that made the floor of the plane vibrate. The passengers began to murmur, some gripping the arms of their seats. Clara looked at the man next to her, but he seemed frozen, his face white as paper. Then the voice returned. "You have been chosen. Each of you carries a secret, a guilt. This is your judgment." The murmurs turned into muffled screams. A woman 2 rows ahead began to pray loudly, while another passenger stood up, trying to open the overhead bin, as if searching for something that could help him. Clara, in turn, felt a chill run through her body. Trial, secret. She tried to process those words. All of this could only be a collective nightmare, something induced. But how? By whom? Before she could think of any more questions, the cabin lights began to flicker, and between the flashes, Clara saw something that made her hold her breath. In the corridor, the shadow of a tall figure formed and disappeared with each flicker of the light. She looked straight down the corridor, but there was no one there. At least, not in sight. "Clara," a low, hoarse voice called her name. She turned around abruptly, but no one was behind her. She felt her heart race. Who knew her name? On instinct, she grabbed the camera she always carried in her bag, hoping to record something, anything that would explain what was happening. Once again, the voice from the sound system spoke. "Get ready. What is coming cannot be avoided." That moment, the oxygen masks fell, but instead of bringing relief, the sight of them hanging there was even more disturbing. No one knew what to do. Some passengers began to scream, others to sob, and in the midst of the chaos, Clara felt a vibration beneath her feet. She looked out the window, trying to find some clue as to where they were. Outside, there were no stars, no lights from the cities below, only infinite darkness. It was as if the plane was suspended in an empty space, with no past, no future. Suddenly, the voice rang out once more, this time clearer, almost human. "Do you think this is a flight? Do you think you're going somewhere?" The sound of laughter echoed through the sound system. Laughter that began as a single guffaw and soon turned into a chorus of voices. Clara couldn't tell if they were male or female, but there was something about them that made her skin crawl. She knew she needed to understand what was happening. Something on that plane was connected to her, but what? Why did they call her by name? Why did she feel like her own memory was starting to fail her with each passing moment? There were many questions, but time seemed to be running out. Something bigger was coming. The atmosphere in the plane's cabin had become unbearable. The passengers were in a state of absolute panic. Clara, however, remained motionless, her heart beating fast as she tried to make sense of it all. The feeling of being watched grew, as if invisible eyes were fixed on her. Suddenly, the vibration beneath her feet grew louder, and a metallic sound echoed through the cabin, coming from the baggage compartment. Clara instinctively turned, looking up. Something inside the compartment seemed to be moving. The other passengers noticed it too, and soon a murmur of fear ran through the plane. One of the men sitting in the middle row stood up, his expression tense, and walked over to the compartment. He hesitated, but finally opened the lid slowly. The sound of something falling echoed, but what he took out was just an ordinary suitcase. "There's nothing here!" he shouted, trying to calm the others. But before he could close it again, the hissing in the sound system returned. Only this time, along with it, the sound of footsteps echoed down the aisle. Even though no one was walking around there, they were slow, heavy steps, as if someone was dragging something across the floor. Clara looked down the aisle and held her breath. The shadow of a figure was projected on the sides of the seats, even though no one was visible there. With each step, the shadow got closer to her row. She pressed herself against the seat, clutching her camera as if it were a shield. The man next to her began to pray quietly, his face wet with tears. "Can't you see?" Clara asked, her voice low and trembling. "Seeing what?" he replied, confused. It was as if Clara was the only one who could perceive the visitor. The shadow stopped right next to her. She felt the air around her grow heavier, almost impossible to breathe. It was then that the voice whispered again, this time in her ear. "You know what you did?" Clara froze. Her heart almost stopped when she heard those words. Something inside her seemed to turn over. Before she could react, the shadow disappeared, and the vibration under the passengers' feet stopped. But the silence that followed was even more terrifying. Clara looked around and realized that all the other passengers were still. Their faces had blank expressions, as if they had been deprived of their souls. She stood up slowly, trembling. The cabin was filled with a dense, cold air, as if something invisible was still there, watching. Suddenly, her camera turned on by itself. The display showed something that made his blood run cold. The figure of a tall, hooded man, standing right in the middle of the hallway. Clara tried to look directly, but there was nothing there. The figure only existed in the camera's viewfinder. When she tried to adjust the focus, the screen flickered and a word appeared on the image. "Confess." Her heart raced. Confess what? What did that entity want from her? Why did it seem to be directly connected to something she couldn't even remember? Doubt grew, and Clara felt that the longer she remained on the plane, the closer she would be to losing her sanity. The silence was broken again, but this time not by footsteps or voices, but by a scream coming from the cockpit. A scream that seemed to be of pure terror. When the plane finally landed, the silence was so oppressive it felt like screaming. Clara was confused and exhausted, her hands shaking and her thoughts jumbled. But when she looked out the window, she realized something that made her breath catch. This was not the airport she was heading to. In fact, it was not any airport she knew. The runways were deserted, the hangars abandoned, and the landscape around her was shrouded in fog, as if they were in a place where time had stopped. The passengers began to get off the plane in complete silence, as if hypnotized. Clara tried to call out to someone, but no one answered. She looked at her camera one last time and saw, on the screen, the same hooded figure that had appeared before. Now, he seemed closer, as if he were waiting for her outside the plane. With no choice, Clara took the first step outside, her heart beating wildly. As she stepped onto the ground, she felt an intense chill run up her spine. The air carried a smell of rust and a distant sound of something that sounded like laughter. And it was at that moment that everything became clear. That place was not an airport. It was not a place where planes went. It was a place from which they never left. Now there is a disturbing question. Did Clara manage to escape? Or is she trapped in this strange landing forever? So what do you think happened to Clara? Was the plane cursed? Did she face something from her own past? Or maybe that place doesn't even exist? Comment below what you think of this story. If you got this far, thank you very much for following this journey full of mysteries and suspense. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss any of the next terrifying stories. Here, the stories only get darker and more impressive. And before you go, one last question for you. What if it were you in Clara's place? How far would you go to find out the truth? Think about it. See you in the next video.